Stella Damascus had lived peacefully on her countryside estate for 15 years. To the gang members who rolled up in leather jackets and stolen luxury cars, she looked like nothing more than an old woman living alone with no one to protect her. Fragile, forgotten, an easy mark. They offered cash, then threats, then chaos. Windows shattered, threats spray-painted on her gates, a final warning delivered. But what they didn't see was the legend she'd buried. 3 decades as La Fantasma, the ghost who controlled the eastern seaboard, empires built in bloodshed, rivals eliminated in silence. So when they came in the night to take what was hers, they met something they never expected. Stella didn't retreat. She fought like the underworld had never let her go. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning light filtered through the conservatory windows in bands of amber and gold, catching dust motes that drifted like lazy spirits above Stella Damascus's teacup. She sat perfectly still in her high-backed chair, one hand cradled around Wedgwood porcelain, the other resting on the arm with fingers that never quite relaxed. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked 6:15 with its gentle chime, right on schedule. Everything in Stella's life moved to a rhythm she'd choreographed 15 years ago when she'd walked away from a world that didn't believe in retirement. Her estate stretched across 12 acres of Pennsylvania countryside, tucked between rolling hills that kept curious eyes at a comfortable distance. The main house was Victorian, all gingerbread trim and widow's walks, painted in soft cream with forest green shutters. To anyone passing by, not that many did, it looked like the kind of place where a cultured widow might spend her golden years in harmless solitude. Gardens bursting with roses and lavender, a greenhouse full of orchids, bird feeders hanging from the ancient oak near the property line, the picture of elegant decline. Stella had purchased it under a name that existed only on paper, paid in cash that had been laundered so many times it might as well have been baptized. The deed was buried under 3 shell corporations and a trust managed by a lawyer who knew better than to ask questions. To the county records, to the postman who left packages at her gate, to the grocery boy who delivered her weekly order, she was simply Mrs. Damascus, a widow, childless, quiet, harmless. She finished her tea and rose, moving through the morning routine she'd perfected into ritual. Breakfast was 2 eggs, precisely cooked with sourdough toast and fresh tomatoes from her garden. She ate slowly, methodically, savoring each bite not from pleasure but from discipline. In her former life, meals had been tactical necessities consumed between meetings where men's fates were decided over wine and white tablecloths. She'd learned to eat without tasting, to smile without meaning it, to kill without flinching. By 7:30 she was in the garden, dressed in loose linen pants and a cotton blouse, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. The rose garden was her pride, though pride was a word she'd trained herself not to feel anymore. 60 varieties, arranged by color and bloom time, each one tended with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to organizing smuggling routes and eliminating competition. She moved between the beds with pruning shears in hand, cutting away dead blooms, checking for aphids, adjusting stakes. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. The scars were there if you knew where to look. A puckered line across her right palm from a knife fight in Newark, 1987. 2 small circles on her left forearm from cigarette burns during an interrogation she'd turned around before the night was through. The crooked pinky finger that had been broken and never set properly because she'd had to finish a job before seeking medical attention. She wore her gloves when she went into town, kept her hands busy with garden work and needlepoint. No one looked closely at an old woman's hands anyway. The conservatory piano received 30 minutes of her attention after lunch. Mozart today, the sonata in C major. Her fingers remembered the notes even when her mind wandered to darker melodies. She'd learned to play as a child in Sicily before her father's deaths had sold her into a marriage that became her apprenticeship in violence. Before she'd proven herself more ruthless than any of the men who'd underestimated her. Before La Fantasma had become the name whispered in back rooms from Boston to Miami. Afternoons were for reading. She kept a library that would have impressed a university professor. Philosophy, history, poetry in 3 languages. She'd educated herself during those decades of blood work, determined to become something more than just another killer in expensive clothes. The books had been her escape plan, her proof that she was building towards something beyond the life she'd been living. When she'd finally walked away, she'd taken nothing but money and books. Dinner was at 6. Chicken piccata with capers and lemon, prepared in her immaculate kitchen while Puccini played from hidden speakers. She ate at the dining table, never in front of the television, maintaining standards even in solitude. After dinner came the ritual she permitted herself only after dark, the walk through her property's perimeter. She changed into dark clothes and soft-soled shoes, tied her hair back tighter, and stepped into the gathering dusk. To anyone watching, she was an old woman taking an evening constitutional, but her eyes swept the tree line with tactical precision, noting broken branches and disturbed earth. Her ears catalogued every sound: the highway 2 miles south, the neighboring farm's dogs, the rustle of deer in the woods. She walked the fence line checking for breaches, examined the locks on her gates, tested the motion sensors she'd installed herself. 15 years she'd maintained this careful balance. 15 years of being invisible, harmless, forgotten. She'd earned this peace with decades of calculated violence and strategic brilliance. She'd walked away at the height of her power, disappeared so completely that most people assumed La Fantasma was dead, or imprisoned, or just another urban legend. But legends don't die. They just wait in rose gardens, pruning shears in hand, for the world to make the mistake of testing them one more time. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a convoy that announced itself like a parade of insecurity. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows and chrome that caught the sunlight like a desperate plea for attention. Stella was deadheading her dahlias when she heard the engines rumbling up her private drive, unauthorized and uninvited. She didn't look up immediately. That would suggest concern, and concern suggested vulnerability. The vehicle stopped 20 feet from her rose garden, doors opening in synchronized choreography that someone had probably practiced. 5 men stepped out, wearing the uniform of wannabe power, leather jackets despite the heat, designer jeans, boots better suited for nightclubs than actual work. The leader was obvious. Mid-30s, dark hair gelled back, a jaw that jetted forward with manufactured confidence. He wore his authority like a new suit that didn't quite fit yet. Stella set down her pruning shears and straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back in a gesture she'd perfected years ago. The little wince, the momentary stiffness. Let them see an old woman's body betraying her. Let them feel superior. Mrs. Damascus, the leader's voice carried across the garden with practiced volume. He wanted her to feel small in the face of his presence. The gate has an intercom for a reason. Her voice was soft, genteel, with just enough edge to remind them they were trespassing. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd learned intimidation from movies. Marko Volkov, I'm here to discuss a business opportunity that benefits us both. Volkov. She placed the name immediately. A family from Brighton Beach trying to expand beyond their Brighton Beach limitations. The grandfather had been nobody, the father had been muscle for the Odessa network, and this one was attempting to build an empire on a foundation of ambition and stupidity. She'd buried better men than 3 generations of Volkovs. I'm not interested in business, Mr. Volkov. I'm retired. She pulled off her gardening gloves finger by finger, a deliberate slowness that forced them to wait. You haven't heard our offer. One of his lieutenants stepped forward, younger, all swagger and bad tattoos visible at his collar. We're prepared to pay top dollar for this property. Cash, no questions. Stella's eyes moved to him with the clinical assessment of the surgeon identifying diseased tissue. And you are? Anton. I handled negotiations. He puffed his chest slightly, gold chains catching the light. You handled nothing. Her voice remained pleasant, almost grandmotherly, which made the words cut deeper. You're an errand boy in a leather jacket pretending the costume makes you dangerous. Your boss brought you along because he needs bodies to look impressive, not because you have anything valuable to contribute to this conversation. Anton's face flushed crimson. His hand twitched toward his waistband before Marco caught his wrist. Smart enough to recognize the hierarchy being challenged, not smart enough to walk away. Mrs. Damascus, Marco's smile had frozen into something uglier. I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't really a negotiation. Your property sits on valuable land. We need it for our operations. You're alone out here. No family, no protection. It would be unfortunate if something happened because you were too stubborn to accept a generous offer. Stella moved toward them with the careful steps of age, stopping at the garden's edge where a small stone marker separated cultivated beauty from wild grass. She didn't cross it, neither did they, and that told her everything she needed to know about their actual commitment to violence. I've been threatened by men who made your grandfather wet himself, Mr. Volkov. I've watched empires rise and fall while you were learning to tie your shoes. You'll leave my property now. You won't return, and you'll spend the next week wondering why you drove away instead of pressing your advantage. She paused, let the silence stretch. The answer is instinct. Some part of your brain that still works recognized that I'm the wrong target. She turned her back on them, a calculated insult, and returned to her dahlias. Behind her, she heard Anton sputter something about respect, heard Marco's sharp command to get back in the vehicles. The engine started. The convoy retreated. But they'd be back. Amateurs always came back. They had something to prove, and proving it mattered more than survival. Stella picked up her pruning shears and returned to her work, already calculating how many days she had before they escalated from posturing to actual threat. 3 days, she estimated, maybe 4 if Marco needed time to work up his courage. She had work to do. The first message arrived on Friday night, spray-painted across her front gate in angry red letters. Last chance, old woman. The grammar was poor, the sentiment unoriginal, the execution sloppy with drips that ran down the wrought iron like blood from an amateur's first kill. Stella examined it in the morning light with the detached interest of a professor grading substandard work. The paint was still tacky, applied sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. based on the drying pattern. One person, right-handed, approximately 5'9" based on the angle and reach of the letters. She left it exactly as it was and returned to her morning tea. Saturday brought broken windows, 3 of them shattered by rocks wrapped in crude notes. Pay up, time's up, get out. The rocks had been thrown from the driveway, not the tree line, suggesting they wanted to be seen on her security cameras. They wanted her to know who was responsible, to feel the weight of their presence. Stella swept up the glass wearing her reading glasses and a cardigan, playing the part of a frightened old woman for cameras she knew they'd be watching from somewhere down the road. She even let her hands shake slightly as she worked, a nice theatrical touch. But when she examined the rocks, she noted the force and trajectory. The same person who'd spray-painted the gate. Anton, probably, or someone of similar build and limited imagination. They were establishing a pattern, starting small to gauge her reaction before escalating to actual violence. It was textbook intimidation, the kind of thing taught by men who'd read books about organized crime instead of living it. Sunday morning delivered the dead rabbit on her doorstep, throat cut, arranged with theatrical precision. This bothered her more than the vandalism, not because of the violence, but because of the waste. Killing for message instead of purpose, destroying something innocent to prove a point to someone who'd orchestrated the deaths of dozens. It showed a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. She buried the rabbit in her garden with more ceremony than it deserved, another performance for watchers she couldn't see but knew were there. She even dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, letting them believe she was crumbling under their campaign of terror.
In reality, she was counting. 5 people in the original convoy. 3 involved in the vandalism based on boot prints in her garden beds. Anton and 2 others, one significantly heavier, one with a limp favoring his left side. They were watching in shifts from 2 locations, a turnout on the county road south of her property and somewhere in the abandoned farmhouse a quarter-mile west. The farmhouse team changed at dusk and dawn, per road watchers rotated every 4 hours. They had no night vision equipment. Their surveillance was visual only, no electronic intercepts or thermal imaging. When they approached her property, they came from the obvious angles, following the driveway and fence line instead of through the woods. They were loud, clumsy, operating on bravado instead of training. Marko Volkov was running this operation like a street shakedown, not a professional extraction. He'd committed resources but not expertise, bodies but not brains. He was testing her while simultaneously exposing every weakness in his own organization. By Monday morning, when she found her mailbox smashed and another note, "Tuesday night we come for you," Stella had compiled a complete tactical assessment. She knew their numbers, their patterns, their capabilities, and most importantly, their limitations. She called her grocery delivery and added 3 items to her usual order: bleach, ammonia, and 10 pounds of sugar. The young man who delivered Tuesday afternoon found her in the garden, as always, humming softly to herself, looking every bit the frightened old woman waiting for nightfall. "You all right, Mrs. Damascus?" he asked, eyeing the spray paint on her gate. "Been having some trouble?" "Just neighborhood children being foolish," she said with a grandmother's weary smile. "Nothing I can't handle, dear." He left convinced she was in denial about her danger, which was exactly what she needed everyone to believe. Let the Volkov crew think their campaign was working, that she was brittle and breaking, that Tuesday night would find her paralyzed with fear. Let them come confident. Confidence made people careless, and careless people made mistakes, and Stella Damascus had built an empire on exploiting other people's mistakes. She returned to her roses and waited for darkness, already 3 moves ahead in a game they didn't even realize they were playing.
The call came Tuesday morning from Tommy Chen, owner of Chen's Market in the town 6 miles from her estate. His voice carried the tremor of a man who'd been shown what fear tasted like and didn't have the stomach for it. "Mrs. Damascus, I'm so sorry." He spoke quickly, words tumbling over themselves. "Some men came by yesterday, said if I keep delivering to you, they'll burn down my store. They knew my daughter's name, knew what school she goes to." A pause, heavy with shame. "I can't deliver anymore. I have to think of my family." Stella listened in silence, foam pressed to her ear, staring out at her rose garden, where morning dew still clung to the petals. Tommy had delivered her groceries for 12 years, always on time, always with a kind word. He'd brought her soup when she'd feigned illness one winter, had refused tips at Christmas until she'd insisted. A good man, caught in the machinery of someone else's war. "I understand completely, Tommy. Family comes first, always." Her voice remained gentle, betraying nothing. "You take care of that beautiful daughter of yours." She ended the call and stood motionless for exactly 60 seconds, allowing herself that small window to feel the fury building in her chest like pressure before an explosion. Then she breathed it out, converted it from emotion into fuel, and moved with purpose toward the kitchen. The entrance to her real basement wasn't through the obvious door off the hallway that led to a perfectly ordinary storage space with holiday decorations and canned preserves. It was through the pantry floor, a section of hardwood that lifted away when you knew which boards to press in sequence. The stairwell descended into darkness that smelled of gun oil and concrete. She hadn't been down here in 8 months. The last time was maintenance, routine checks on equipment she'd hoped never to use again. The lights flickered on with her touch, revealing a space that existed in sharp contrast to the Victorian elegance above. Concrete walls lined with weapons racks and locked cabinets, a workbench with tools for purposes that had nothing to do with gardening, boxes of ammunition stacked with military precision, a gun safe that required her fingerprint and a code she'd never written down. The safe opened with a pneumatic hiss. Inside hung her tools, cleaned and oiled, waiting like loyal soldiers. She lifted out the Beretta 92FS first, her preferred sidearm from the years when preference had meant the difference between walking away and being carried. The weight settled into her palm with muscle memory that transcended the 15 years since she last used it in anger. 2 spare magazines, loaded with hollow points. No hesitation, no mercy. The HK-416 carbine came next, modified with a suppressor and optics that cost more than most people's cars. Room-clearing weapon, precise and devastating. She'd used it in a warehouse in Baltimore, eliminating 6 men in under 30 seconds before disappearing into the night like she'd never existed. Beside the weapons, she retrieved equipment she'd maintained with the same discipline as her garden. Body armor, lightweight and flexible enough for someone her age. Night vision goggles, flashbang grenades that looked like props from a movie but were devastatingly real. Motion sensors, surveillance cameras small enough to hide in fence posts, wireless microphones that could pick up conversation from 100 yards. The last item she removed sat in its own locked drawer, wrapped in silk like something precious. The encrypted satellite phone, completely off-grid, connected to a network that didn't officially exist. She powered it on and waited while it cycled through authentication protocols. The screen glowed green. 3 contacts remained in the directory, names from a life she'd tried to leave behind. Vincent the priest in Philadelphia. She'd saved his life in '98, taken a bullet meant for his spine at a failed hit at his daughter's wedding. He'd sworn a blood debt. Maria Calabresi in Newark. Former rival turned reluctant ally, then friend. The only person besides Stella who'd survived the Atlantic City purge of 2003. And James Reeves, the former FBI agent she'd turned 30 years ago, who'd been feeding her information and protection ever since. He'd be retired now, but men like James never really retired. She stared at the names, 3 ghosts from a past that was supposed to stay buried. Calling them meant admitting La Fantasma still existed, meant pulling them back into the life they'd all worked to escape. It meant crossing a threshold she'd promised herself she'd never cross again. But they'd threatened Tommy's daughter. They'd made this personal in ways that transcended property and pride. They'd demonstrated they had no boundaries, no honor, no understanding of the lines you didn't cross. Stella selected Vincent's number and pressed call. The line rang twice before his familiar rasp answered. "I was wondering when you'd remember my number." "I need a favor," she said simply. "La Fantasma calls. I answer. Always." No hesitation, no questions. Just loyalty that time hadn't diminished. She smiled in the darkness of her arsenal, surrounded by tools of violence and instruments of precision, and felt something she hadn't in 15 years. She felt like herself again. Stella began with a map she drew from memory on graph paper, every inch of her 12 acres rendered in precise scale. The main house at the center, the greenhouse to the east, the old barn she used for storage to the west. Fence lines, tree positions, natural cover, elevation changes. She marked the 3 most likely approach vectors in red, the main driveway, the service road behind the barn, and the gap in the fence line where the creek cut through her property. Every tactical advantage, every kill zone, every piece of cover that could protect or expose. She worked through Tuesday afternoon with the focused intensity of a chess master arranging pieces for an endgame only she could see. The motion sensors went up first, camouflaged in fence posts and tucked into tree bark, creating an invisible perimeter that would alert her the moment anyone crossed onto her land. She synced them to the tablet she'd kept charged all these years, watching the display until she was satisfied with the coverage. The cameras came next, 8 of them positioned to eliminate blind spots. She mounted them in birdhouses and garden ornaments, in the eaves of the barn and behind the conservatory shutters. Anyone approaching would be observed from multiple angles, their positions tracked, their numbers counted. In the rose garden, she buried tripwires connected to floodlights she'd repositioned from decorative to tactical. Not to injure, but to blind and expose. She wanted them stumbling, disoriented, silhouetted against light while she remained in shadow. The garden paths she knew by heart could navigate in complete darkness by counting steps and recognizing the scent of specific blooms. Her territory, her advantage.
The barn received special attention. She cleared the center space and arranged hay bales into makeshift cover, creating firing positions with clear sight lines to all 3 approaches. Ammunition caches went into waterproof boxes buried in spots she'd memorized. If she needed to fall back, she'd never be far from resupply. She placed emergency medical supplies in the house, the barn, and the greenhouse. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, painkillers. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Between preparations, she made her calls. Vincent arrived first, just after dusk on Tuesday. He'd aged like she had, gray at the temples, lines carved deep around his eyes, but he still moved with the economical grace of someone who'd lived by violence. He carried a duffel bag that clinked with familiar sounds. "You've built something nice here," he said, surveying her estate. "Shame to ruin it with bodies." They ruined it when they threatened a grocer's daughter. She led him to the barn, showed her preparations. He nodded approval, added suggestions, reinforced her weakest angles with his own expertise. Maria came Wednesday morning, driving a rental car with plates that would trace back to someone who didn't exist. She was smaller than Stella remembered, but her eyes still carried the cold calculation that had made her legendary. She brought thermal scopes and communication equipment, hugged Stella like they'd seen each other yesterday instead of 15 years ago. "You always did know how to throw a party," Maria said, examining the tripwires with professional appreciation. James Reeves arrived last, Wednesday afternoon, still moving like law enforcement even in retirement. He brought information instead of weapons, surveillance photos of the Volkov crew, rap sheets, known associates. He'd made calls, activated old networks, ensured that when this was over, the right people would look the other way. "Marco Volkov's planning something big tonight," James said, spreading photos across her kitchen table. "My source says 12 men, heavily armed. They think it's overkill for an old woman, but Marco's ego is bruised. He wants to make a statement. He'll make one, just not the one he planned." They worked together through the afternoon, 3 ghosts and a legend, turning her sanctuary into a killing floor. Vincent positioned himself in the barn with a rifle and clear sightlines. Maria took the greenhouse with the thermal scope, watching approaches from the east. James would coordinate from the house, monitoring cameras and communications, ready to provide overwatch. Stella walked her property one last time as the sun set, checking every sensor, every wire, every position. The roses swayed in the evening breeze, oblivious to what was coming. She'd built this place to escape violence, cultivated beauty to bury brutality, but violence had found her anyway, as she had always known it would. She returned to the house and changed into dark tactical clothing, strapped on her body armor, loaded her weapons with ritualistic care. The Beretta at her hip, the carbine in her hands, extra magazines distributed across her vest. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not Mrs. Damascus, the widow with her roses and her tea. La Fantasma, the ghost. Home at last.
They came at 11:30, exactly when James's source had predicted, arrogant enough to announce their approach with headlights and engine noise. 2 vehicles this time, a pickup truck and a sedan, rolling up the driveway like they were arriving at a party instead of an execution. Stella watched them on her tablet from the darkened kitchen, counting heads as they emerged. 6 men, all armed, moving with the false confidence of people who'd never faced real opposition. Marco wasn't among them. Of course not. Leaders who sent others to do their killing rarely survived to become legends. Anton led the group, barking orders with gestures too large, too theatrical. 2 men peeled off toward the barn. 2 more circled toward the back of the house, while Anton and another stayed near the vehicles, presumably to coordinate the easy victory they expected. Vincent's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Barn team approaching. I have them." "Wait for my signal," Stella murmured, moving through her house with practiced silence, using the darkness like a second skin. She'd killed the main power 30 minutes ago, leaving them to navigate by flashlight while she operated by memory and moonlight.
The backdoor team reached the conservatory first, one of them producing a crowbar to jimmy the lock. She let them work, let them feel successful, let them step inside where her roses perfumed the air with sweetness that would soon smell like copper and cordite. They swept their lights across the space, guns drawn but pointed carelessly, still treating this like intimidation instead of warfare. She shot the first one through the throat from 10 feet away, the Beretta's suppressor reducing the shot to a mechanical cough. He went down clutching his neck, confusion frozen on his face before the life drained out. The second one spun toward the sound, flashlight beam catching empty space where she'd already moved, and she put 2 rounds center mass before he could shout a warning. Both bodies crumpled among her orchids, blood pooling on Italian tile. "Back team down," she whispered into her mic, already moving toward the front of the house. Outside, Anton was checking his phone, oblivious. The 2 men who'd approached the barn had stopped responding to his radio calls, but he hadn't processed what that meant yet. Vincent had been busy, silent and efficient as always. Stella emerged from her front door like a ghost materializing from shadow, the carbine shouldered and aimed before Anton's companion even registered her presence. She dropped him with a single shot to the head, the suppressed round barely louder than a book slamming shut. He collapsed against the pickup truck, leaving a smear down the door panel. Anton spun, finally understanding, gun coming up too slow because his brain was still catching up to reality. "What the—" "You threatened a child," Stella said, her voice carrying across the distance with absolute calm. "You vandalized my home. You killed my rabbit." She advanced down the porch steps, weapon trained on her center mass. "But worse, you wasted my time with amateur theatrics when you should have studied who you were dealing with." He fired wild, panic overtaking training he'd never really had. 3 shots that went wide, hitting nothing but night air. She didn't flinch, didn't rush, just closed the distance with measured steps and put a round through his right shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the gravel screaming, gun skittering away. She stood over him, carbine aimed at his face. "How many more are coming?" "I don't—" he gasped, clutching his shoulder. 6 more. Tomorrow night. Marco's bringing everyone." "Tomorrow?" She tilted her head slightly. "You were the advance team, the ones who'd soften me up, make me terrified, so the real assault would find me broken." She almost smiled. Poor planning. "Please, I have a family." "So did Tommy Chen. So did I once." She lowered the weapon slightly. "You'll live if you apply pressure and get yourself to a hospital. Tell Marco that La Fantasma sends her regards. Tell him I'm done being polite." She shot him in the left kneecap, ensuring he wouldn't be walking or fighting anytime soon, then turned away from his screaming and walked back to her house. Vincent and Maria emerged from their positions, sweeping the grounds, confirming all targets neutralized. 5 bodies cooling in her rose garden and driveway, 1 survivor who'd carry a message and a limp for the rest of his life. The night air smelled like summer flowers and gun smoke, a combination that pulled her back 30 years to nights when violence had been her language and death her punctuation. "Clean sweep," Vincent reported, checking the barn team. "No casualties on our side." Stella surveyed her property, the careful sanctuary she'd built, now christened in blood again. The rose bushes swayed in the breeze, indifferent to the carnage at their roots. "Tomorrow night they'll come with everything," she said quietly. "Marco will want revenge now, not just property." "Good," Maria said, checking her rifle. "Let them come angry. Angry people make mistakes." Stella nodded, already running through preparations for the next assault. They had less than 24 hours to fortify, to prepare, to transform her estate from killing floor to absolute massacre. She looked forward to it with something that might have been anticipation, or might have been the closest thing to happiness she'd felt in 15 years.
Marco Volkov received the call at 2 a.m. from a hospital in Harrisburg, where Anton had dragged himself, bleeding and incoherent, babbling about ghosts and an old woman who moved like death. 5 of his men were dead, scattered across that cursed property like discarded trash. Anton would never walk right again, would carry a limp and nightmares for whatever remained of his pathetic life. Marco sat in his office above the nightclub he used as headquarters, staring at Anton's message, at the name his lieutenant had gasped out between morphine dreams, La Fantasma, the ghost. It meant nothing to him initially, just delusional rambling from a man in shock. But something in the way Anton had said it, the terror that transcended physical pain, made Marco start digging. He called Dmitri first, his uncle who'd been connected since the 80s, who remembered when the families actually ran things before everything became fragmented and chaotic. Dmitri answered on the 5th ring, voice thick with sleep and irritation. "You ever heard of someone called La Fantasma?" Marco asked without preamble. The silence stretched so long Marco thought the connection had dropped. Then Dimitri's voice came back, different now, stripped of irritation and replaced with something Marco had never heard from him before. Fear. "Where did you hear that name?" "From an old woman living on property I need. Why?" "Bože moi." Dmitri switched to Russian, cursing with religious fervor. "You attacked her? You actually went after La Fantasma?" "Who the hell is she?" "Not is, boy, was. La Fantasma ran the entire eastern seaboard in the 90s. She controlled everything from Boston to Miami. Drugs, weapons, protection, politicians. She disappeared 15 years ago, and every family breathed easier, because when she was active, she was untouchable." Dimitri's breathing came harsh over the line. "They say she killed 30 men personally. They say she walked into a meeting of the 5 families and walked out with 3 of them dead and the other 2 begging for mercy. They say, Marco cut him off, anger masking the cold dread creeping up his spine. "Stories from old men. She's 70-something years old, living alone. I sent 6 armed men. And now 5 are dead and 1 is crippled." Dimitri's voice turned sharp. "Listen to me carefully, nephew. Walk away. Forget the property. Forget your pride. La Fantasma being alive changes everything. If she's come out of retirement, it means you've forced her hand, and that means you're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Marco ended the call and threw his phone across the room, watching it shatter against exposed brick. Stories, legends, bullshit meant to scare children and justify failure. He'd built his organization from nothing, expanded when others contracted, taken territory through will and violence. He wasn't going to be stopped by some geriatric woman and ghost stories from his uncle's generation. But doubt gnawed at him anyway, so he kept researching. He found fragments online, buried in true crime forums and digitized newspaper archives. The Atlantic City Massacre of 2003, 7 bodies found in a warehouse, all high-ranking members of the Giordano family, all killed execution style, unsolved. A Baltimore drug war in 1998 that ended when both factions mysteriously disappeared in a single night, unsolved. The Newark politician who'd taken bribes from 4 different families and was found in his car with a single bullet behind his ear and a rose on the dashboard. Unsolved. Always unsolved. Always the same whispers in the comments. La Fantasma's work. He found a single photograph from an FBI surveillance operation in 1995, grainy and distant, showing a woman in elegant clothes entering a restaurant in Philadelphia. The caption identified her as Person of Interest Organized Crime Investigation. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her posture, the way she carried herself, radiated controlled power. The same age she'd be now, 73, 74? Marco stared at the photo until his eyes burned. This couldn't be the same woman. That woman in the floral dress, pruning roses, moving with careful elderly steps. But he remembered her eyes when she'd humiliated Anton, the surgical precision of her insults, the way she'd turned her back on 5 armed men without fear. He'd thought it was senility or stupidity. Now he wondered if it had been something worse. Confidence. His phone, the replacement he kept charged, buzzed with a text from his remaining lieutenant, Sergei. "Anton is awake. Says she told him to give you a message. She's done being polite."
Marco crushed his phone in his fist, the screen cracking. Rage burned away doubt, replaced calculation with raw need for revenge. He didn't care if she was La Fantasma or God himself. She'd killed his men, humiliated his organization, made him look weak when he was trying to build an empire. In this business, weakness is death, mercy is suicide. He started making calls. Every man he had, every favor owed, every piece of equipment he could acquire. If she wanted war, he'd bring her war that would make her legends look like fairy tales. He'd bury La Fantasma for real this time and build his empire on her grave.
They came at midnight exactly, and this time Marco led from the front, his pride overriding whatever survival instinct he might have possessed. 3 vehicles, 12 men, body armor and automatic weapons that looked impressive but would mean nothing against preparation and experience. Stella watched them stage at the end of her driveway through thermal imaging, counting weapons, noting the breech rams and flashbangs that suggested they'd learned something from their first failure. Not enough, but something. "Vincent, you see the rear team?" she murmured into her mic. 4 men circling through the woods, amateurs. They're snapping branches like they're on a nature hike. "Maria, 3 coming through the eastern fence line. They cut through, but they're silhouetted against the road lights. I can drop them whenever you're ready." James's voice crackled from the house. Marco and 5 others pushing up the main drive. They've got a battering ram. Looks like they plan to come straight through your front door. Stella smiled in the darkness of her barn loft, carbine resting against her shoulder, watching Marco's team advance with the certainty of people who'd never encountered real opposition. They moved in a wedge formation, something they'd probably learned from a YouTube video, tactically sound in theory, but executed with gaps wide enough to drive a truck through. "Let them commit," she said. "Wait until they're all inside the perimeter." Marco's team reached the porch. 2 men hefted the battering ram while the others provided cover, sweeping their weapons across windows that revealed nothing. The ram struck her reinforced door once, twice, the wood splintering but the internal steel frame holding. On the 3rd impact, Stella triggered the tripwires. Floodlights exploded across her property with the intensity of a sports stadium, turning night into day and Marco's men into frozen silhouettes. They threw up hands against the glare, night vision shattered, tactical advantage evaporated. In that moment of blindness, the shooting started. Maria took the eastern team first, 3 precise shots from the greenhouse that dropped them before they understood where death was coming from. Vincent opened up on the rear approach, firing methodically, each round a punctuation mark in someone's final sentence. Bodies fell in the woods with barely a sound beyond the suppressed coughs of his rifle. Marco's team recovered fast, credit where due, returning fire toward the barn and greenhouse. Bullets sparked off metal, shattered windows chewed into wood, but they were firing at muzzle flashes and guesses while Stella's team fired at targets illuminated like stage performers. Stella descended from the barn through the back exit, moving through her garden with practiced silence while Marco's men focused on the wrong threats. She came up behind their flank, carbine raised, and began her work. 2 shots dropped the men guarding Marco's rear. A 3rd round caught someone in the leg as he turned, sending him screaming to the gravel. The others scattered, formation collapsing into panic. Marco shouted orders that nobody followed, his authority evaporating under accurate fire from multiple positions. He dove behind one of the vehicles, 3 men following, trying to establish cover and regroup. Mistake. Stella had positioned Vincent with overlapping fields of fire for exactly this scenario. The barn's side window erupted with muzzle flash. 2 men dropped. Marco scrambled toward the second vehicle, abandoning his wounded, and Vincent tracked him with professional patience before putting a round through the engine block. The vehicle died with a mechanical wheeze, smoke billowing from the hood. "He's running," Vincent reported, "heading for the tree line, southwest." "Let him go," Stella said, advancing through the chaos. 2 men remained mobile on the driveway, firing wildly, wasting ammunition on shadows. She dropped one with a headshot, let the other surrender when he threw down his weapon and raised his hands. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. 12 men had breached her property. 8 were dead, 3 wounded, 1 surrendering.
Marko Volkov was crashing through the woods like a panicked deer, leaving his men behind to save himself. Maria emerged from the greenhouse, thermal scope still raised. "Want me to run him down?" Stella lowered her weapon, surveying the carnage littering her driveway. Bodies sprawled in positions that spoke of sudden death, blood pooling on gravel she'd raked that morning. Her roses remained untouched, swaying gently in the breeze that carried the smell of cordite and failure. "No," she said quietly. "Let him run. Let him tell everyone what happened here. Let him spend the rest of his miserable life looking over his shoulder, wondering when La Fantasma will decide he's suffered enough." James approached from the house, already on his phone making calls that would ensure the right people arrived to clean this up, that the bodies would disappear into the system with paperwork that told convenient lies. Vincent zip-tied the survivor and the wounded, professional and efficient. Stella walked through the aftermath, checking each body clinically detached, ensuring threats were neutralized. She found one man still breathing, clutching a stomach wound, eyes wide with pain and terror. "Please," he gasped, "I have—" "Everyone has someone," she interrupted, not unkindly. "But you chose this. You came to my home. You threatened innocent people. You forced me to become something I'd spent 15 years trying to forget." She stood over him, weapon lowered. "Ambulance is coming. You'll live if you're strong enough. Learn from this." She left him there and walked back to her house, stepping over bodies and spent casings, past the roses that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. Vincent and Maria followed, neither speaking, understanding that some moments required silence. Inside her kitchen, Stella set down her weapon and removed her body armor with movements that felt heavy, exhausted. Her hands were steady, but her soul felt tired in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "It's done," Maria said softly. "No," Stella replied, staring out at her property where sirens were beginning to wail in the distance. "It's just beginning again."
Marko Volkov's body was found 3 weeks later in a shipping container at the Philadelphia docks, though James made sure the official report listed it as a drug deal gone wrong. No connection to the events at Stella's estate, no investigation that might lead curious law enforcement too close to questions better left unasked. The container also held 2 of Marko's remaining lieutenants, and enough evidence of their trafficking operations to satisfy anyone who cared to look. Stella had made the calls herself, personally, not out of vengeance. That emotion had burned out somewhere during the Midnight War, but out of necessity. Marko had seen her face, knew her identity, and men like him always talked when given the chance. Loose ends were how legends died, and peaceful retirements ended in prison cells or shallow graves. Vincent had handled it with his usual efficiency, and Stella had returned to her roses the next day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the criminal underworld like wildfire through dry timber. La Fantasma had returned. The ghost was back. 12 men had gone to kill an old woman, and only their bodies had come home. The Volkov syndicate had collapsed overnight, territory absorbed by organizations smart enough not to ask questions about how it became available. Nobody wanted to be the next crew that tested whether the legends were true. Stella's phone, the encrypted one she'd hoped to never use again, rang constantly for the first week. Old associates offering respect, former rivals requesting meetings, younger criminals seeking her blessing or her wisdom. She ignored most of them, answered a select few with terse instructions to leave her alone unless the matter was worthy of disturbing her retirement. After 2 weeks, the calls slowed. After a month, they stopped entirely. The message had been received. La Fantasma was alive, but not available for consultation, feared, but not interested in rebuilding an empire, respected, but determined to maintain her sanctuary. Tommy Chen returned with her grocery delivery on a sunny Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after everything had ended. He climbed from his truck with visible nervousness, carrying bags that probably contained apologies along with her usual order of eggs and vegetables. "Mrs. Damascus," he began, setting the bags on her porch, "I'm so sorry for—" "You protected your daughter," Stella interrupted, pruning her roses with the same careful precision she'd always employed. "That's what any good father would do. There's nothing to apologize for. The men who threatened me, he paused, searching for words. They're gone. All of them. I heard. She didn't look up from her work. Terrible business, gang violence. The world is becoming so unsafe. Tommy studied her for a long moment, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time, noting the scars on her hands and the way her eyes never stopped cataloging exits and approaches. Thank you, he said quietly. She nodded once, and he left without another word, understanding that some truths were better acknowledged in silence. Vincent and Maria stayed for 2 more weeks, helping repair the damage to her property, replacing windows and patching bullet holes. They worked without complaint, old soldiers maintaining the fortress of a legend they had always believed in. When they finally left, it was with embraces that felt like farewells to one life and acceptance of another. You know where to find me, Vincent said from his car, engine idling. I do, but I hope I never need to look. He smiled, sad and understanding, and drove away. James visited monthly after that, bringing news from the world she'd half returned to, updating her on movements and politics in the families that still operated. He never stayed long, just coffee and conversation, a bridge between her 2 identities that she'd finally stopped pretending were separate. 3 months after the Midnight War, Stella sat on her porch at dawn, tea cooling in her cup, watching the sun paint her rose garden in shades of amber and gold. The estate looked exactly as it had before, peaceful, beautiful, isolated. But the isolation felt different now, not loneliness, but choice, not hiding, but sovereignty. A black car approached slowly up her drive, expensive and respectful. It stopped at a polite distance, and a young man emerged wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He approached with careful deference, stopping at the garden's edge without invitation to cross. Mrs. Damascus, he said, voice carrying practiced respect. I represent the Castellano family. We wanted to pay our respects and offer our protection should you ever need it. Stella set down her teacup and regarded him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Tell your employer I appreciate the gesture. Tell him La Fantasma requires no protection, but values the Castellanos' continued wisdom in staying out of her affairs. The young man nodded, relief evident. Of course, the family wishes only peace between us. Then we understand each other perfectly. He returned to his car and departed, another message delivered to the underworld. The ghost was retired, but not defenseless, peaceful, but not weak, available neither for alliance nor conquest. Stella returned to her roses, pruning with surgical care, cultivating beauty with hands that had earned their rest through 40 years of blood and strategy. The roses didn't care about her past. They grew because she gave them attention, care, and the discipline that came from understanding that beauty and violence were sometimes cultivated by the same hands. She was finally at peace, not despite who she was, but because of it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I've hand-picked 2 more stories I think you'll love. Have a beautiful day.